Well, thank you, Pastor Doug, for the invitation to be here. Thank you all for attending. It's a privilege to address this topic, John Owen and his influence on the Baptist. I want to begin by asking, have you ever considered when John Owen may have met his first Baptist? May seem like an odd question to ask. It's rather easy to read a Baptist theologian and to pick up Owen and to quickly begin the work of comparing and contrasting their theological systems and their ideas. It's an exciting task, the work of uncovering similarities as well as tensions and declensions in the thought of figures as such stature and prominence within the theological traditions we inherit, like Owen certainly was. But for as stimulating as systematizing into a coherent whole the thought of our favorite theologians can be, there's a sense in which by doing so we may force these figures into boxes in which they do not fit or make their ideas static in ways that the changing circumstances and contexts in which they were formed simply could not allow. I've had to ask similar questions in my work on Owen and the Roman Catholics. That's where I've spent most of my time on Owen. When was the first time that Owen actually met a Roman Catholic? Could it have been after the Restoration when visiting with Charles II and his Catholic brother James, the Duke of York? Or sooner, perhaps in Dublin during the Cromwellian campaign in Ireland? And so similarly, when did Owen meet his first Baptist? Perhaps in the early 1650s, when Parliament had them alongside Owen as part of a response to the alarm caused by the publication of the Racovian Catechism. My point, of course, is not to overstate the importance of how Owen's familiarity with a group, the Catholics or the Baptists or any other group, on a personal level could influence his thinking about them, although it could, but to give an example of how readers of Owen could be assisted by a cautiously historical approach to understanding his thought and influence. For Owen's thinking, as we will likely see through many of the talks at this conference, and you probably already have through the first couple of sessions, was anything but static. He could change over time, and he admitted as much. And the development of his ideas so often was deeply tied to the social, the political, and the broader theological context in which he found himself. And so I would suggest that the subject of Owen's influence on the Baptist is really no different. It is such a large topic, for Owen did seem to impact the early Baptists in a lot of different ways. And this is probably to be expected when you consider Baptist interests, as many have pointed out, in locating their theology within the larger context of the English theological landscape. Or when you consider Owen's tendency to shift and adapt over time to the many circumstances that required him to articulate his beliefs in new ways, resulting sometimes in Protestants of all varieties finding a spokesman for their views in this most eminent of Puritan divines. And so Owen's influence on the early Baptists and their confession. It's a topic which may be difficult to discuss if we were to attempt to flatly approach Owen's thought as a singular and unified body, though in the many debates that have grown out of this question of Owen's relationship to Baptist theology, that does seem to be tempting, for we do kind of naturally want to impose a coherence upon Owen's theology that its historical development simply will not sustain. And so I kind of want to proceed in a few stages. First, I want to survey for you the sort of modern debate over Owen's relationship to Baptist covenant theology. It's a debate that's largely centered around his understanding of the Mosaic and Abrahamic covenants. Then I want to examine how the early particular Baptists actually appropriated Owen, what they adopted and what they adapted. And then finally, I'll just offer a few historical considerations that maybe complicate an overly neat account of Owen's influence. So the debate about the covenants and Owen's influence. Complicated is probably the right word. That's probably the term of which Owen himself would approve in describing this topic. For just as the relationship of God's covenants has generated substantial viewpoints with regard to his influence on Baptist theology, Owen recognized that this is a subject wrapped up in much obscurity and attended with many difficulties. Some who observe the complexities in Owen's covenant theology are equally puzzled that anyone could arrive at Baptist viewpoints from Owen's words, often arguing that whereas Owen distinguishes between the Abrahamic and Mosaic covenants, Baptists sometimes conflate the two. The argument essentially goes that modern Baptist appeals to Owen often fail to distinguish his treatment of the Mosaic and the Abrahamic covenants. They argue that Owen's well-known departure from the Westminster majority concerning the Mosaic covenant, namely his rejection of the traditional Reformed view that the Old and New covenants were one in substance and kind, differing only in degree and in the form of administration, instead affirming that they are different in kind, not degree. Nevertheless, the argument goes, they contend that this departure does not undermine his defense of infant baptism, because that defense never rested upon Sinai in the first place. Rather, Owen, like Calvin, and the broader Reformed tradition, grounded baptism in the abiding promises made to Abraham. While Owen regarded the Mosaic covenant as a distinct legal covenant that expired with the coming of Christ, he did not regard the Abrahamic covenant in the same way. For Owen, he could argue that the new covenant is new in contrast to Moses, not Abraham. Thus, Jeremiah 31 contrasts the new covenant with the Sinaitic covenant, while the Abrahamic promise continues through its fulfillment in Christ. Consequently, it is argued that Baptists may mistakenly infer Credo Baptist conclusions from Owen's Mosaic theology while overlooking a continued appeal to the Abrahamic covenant as the basis for the inclusion of believers' children in the visible covenant community. Thus, from this perspective, the Baptist appeal to Owen's minority position on the Mosaic covenant ultimately proves too much. For whatever revisions Owen introduced concerning Sinai, he, with Calvin and contemporaries like Thomas Goodwin, located the warrant for infant baptism not in the Mosaic economy, but in the perpetual promise made to Abraham. So, in other words, Baptists are looking in the wrong place. If they want to appropriate Owen for Baptist theology, they need to actually deal with the Abrahamic covenant. Yet matters are not quite so simple. There is a common objection that rightly notes that Owen continued to ground infant baptism in Abraham. Nevertheless, Owen's own covenantal language often resisted such easy categorization. At times, he speaks in broad theological categories, reducing redemptive history to the two overarching covenants of works and grace. At other times, however, his detailed exegesis of Hebrews distinguishes the Mosaic and the New Covenants as genuinely distinct covenants, while simultaneously insisting that the covenant of grace remained the only means by which sinners were ever saved. And it's precisely that combination of continuity and discontinuity that has made Owen so difficult to classify, and as we'll see, I hope, so attractive to the early particular Baptists. So, for example, hear how Owen distinguishes the Mosaic covenant from the covenant of grace while emphasizing the genuine newness of the new covenant. He writes, "For some, when they hear that the covenant of grace was always one and the same, of the same nature and efficacy under both testaments, that the way of salvation by Christ was always one and the same, we are ready to think that there was no such great difference between their state and ours as is pretended. But we see that on this supposition, that covenant which God brought the people into at Sinai, and under the yoke whereof they were to abide until the new covenant was established, had all the disadvantages attending it, which we have insisted on. And those who understand not how excellent and glorious those privileges are, which are added unto the covenant of grace, as to the administration of it, by the introduction and establishment of the new covenant, are utterly unacquainted with the nature of spiritual and heavenly things." Yet only one chapter earlier, Owen had spoken in much broader theological categories. Hear Owen again. "There were never absolutely any more than two covenants wherein all persons indefinitely are concerned. The first was the covenant of works made with Adam and with all in him. And what he did as the head of that covenant, as our representative therein, is imputed unto us, as if we had done it. The other is that of grace, made originally with Christ, and through him with all the elect. And here lie the life and hope of our souls, that what Christ did as the head of that covenant, as our representative, is all imputed unto us for righteousness and salvation." So here he's no longer speaking about the particular biblical covenants of redemptive history, but about the two overarching covenantal principles under which humanity stands before God. Nor does Owen permit this distinction between Sinai and the new covenant to undermine the continuity of salvation itself. For he also says, "The substance of the covenant of grace was the only way and means of salvation unto the church from the first entrance of sin." Owen was very clearly doing several things at once. And as one person noted of this issue, leaving very learned men perplexed and confused. But the reality is that Baptists actually did find utility in Owen's covenant theology. And not just Sinai, but the Abrahamic covenant too. And thus, if Baptists have been misusing Owen, I believe the point is that they have always been misusing Owen. For Baptists, or early Baptists like Nehemiah Cox, for example, he found Owen's Hebrews commentary very useful. Many of you will know his Discourse of the Covenants, published in 1681, where he mentions that the notion, which is often supposed in this discourse, that the old covenant and the new do differ in substance and not in the manner of their administration only, doth indeed require a more large and particular handling to free it from those prejudices and difficulties that have been cast upon it by many worthy persons who are otherwise minded. And accordingly, he continues, I designed to have given a farther account of it in a discourse of the covenant made with Israel in the wilderness and the state of the church under the law. But when I had finished this and provided some materials also for what was to follow, I found my labor for the clearing and asserting of that point happily prevented by the coming forth of Dr. Owen's third volume upon the Hebrews, where it is largely discoursed, and the objections that seem to lie against it fully answered. Especially, he says, in the exposition of the 8th chapter, whither, he continues, I now refer my reader for satisfaction about it, which he will there find answerable to what might be expected from so great and learned a person. That material to which he refers, of course, was Hebrews volume, the Hebrews volume that was published in 1680, so just before Cox's publication here, and it covered chapters 6 through 10, and that's volumes 5 and 6 of our Banner of Truth edition. And Cox was commending Owen for demonstrating that the old, that is the Mosaic covenant, and the new covenant differed in substance, but in fact, other Baptists like Kiffin, Knowles, Benjamin Cox also had been dealing with the Abrahamic covenant much sooner, arguing that God made an everlasting covenant of grace with Abraham and his seed. Now, the scriptures declare that Abraham had two kinds of seed, one born after the flesh, the other born after the spirit. And the question is, they ask, who are counted for Abraham's seed according to the covenant of grace? Now, as others have pointed out, these Baptists recognize that the two seeds were reflective of two separate covenants with Abraham. In Genesis 17, the apostle witnesseth, they continued, that these two covenants which God made with Abraham and his seed, to wit, a covenant of works with Abraham's fleshly seed, and a covenant of grace with Abraham's spiritual seed. You see, they were arguing from Abraham to say that if your position from Genesis 17 is that from here you can prove infant baptism, I'm quoting from them, drawing on Abraham's fleshly seed and, quote, affirming that there is but one covenant in that scripture, they're saying then you are mistaken. And again, I'm drawing here on work done by others who have noticed that this thinking was present in Baptists quite early. You see this in Edward Hutchinson in his a treatise concerning the covenant and baptism. And in that text, he appeals to that judicious and eminent divine Dr. Owen for help in communicating this idea that Abraham's natural and spiritual seed reflected two distinct covenant realities: a temporal covenant of circumcision for his physical descendants, and a spiritual covenant for those united by faith, whose covenant sign is baptism. And Hutchinson says Owen's bare words were sufficient to make that case. And so I want to read an extended passage that Hutchinson quotes in full, and it's quite long. The extent of it is in the little handout that some of you may have there. I want to read a bit of it. I won't read that entire thing, but it is a little bit lengthy. And this may give you some taste of Owen here. And so this is coming from this 1668 publication of his Hebrews commentary. Owen writes, "Two privileges did God grant unto Abraham upon his separation to a special interest in the old promise and covenant. First, that according to the flesh, he should be the father of the Messiah, the promised seed, who was the very life of the covenant, the fountain and cause of all the blessings contained in it. That this privilege was temporary, having a limited season, time, and end appointed unto it. The very nature of the thing itself doth demonstrate. For upon this actual exhibition in the flesh, it was to cease." Now, Owen would continue by turning to Abraham's second privilege. He says, "Secondly, together with this, he had also another privilege granted unto him, namely that he saith, whereby he was personally interested in the covenant, should be the pattern of the faith of the church in all generations, and that none should ever come to be a member of it or share in its blessings, but by the same faith that he had fixed on the seed that was in the promise to be brought forth from him in the world." He goes on, "Answerable unto this twofold end of the separation of Abraham, there was a double seed allotted unto him, a seed according to the flesh, separated to the bringing forth of the Messiah according to the flesh, and a seed according to the promise, that is, such as by faith have an interest in the promise, or all the elect of God. Now, after explaining how these two seeds could overlap historically, Owen's going to conclude, and this is continuing on in your page. Now, it is evident that it is the second privilege and spiritual seed wherein the church to whom the promises are made is founded, and whereof it doth consist, namely in them who by faith are interested in the covenant of Abraham, whether they be of carnal seed or no. He goes on, and herein lay the great mistake of the Jews of old, wherein they are followed by their posterity unto this day. They thought no more was needful to interest them in the covenant of Abraham, but that they were his seed according to the flesh. Now, after arguing that this fleshly privilege had reached its end with the coming of Christ, Owen returns then to the significance of Abraham's faith, where you see him say, we have seen then that Abraham, on the account of his faith and not of his separation according to the flesh, was the father of all that believe and heir of the world. And in the covenant made with him, so as that which concerns not the bringing forth of the promised seed according to the flesh, but as unto faith therein. And in the work of redemption to be performed thereby lies the foundation of the church in all ages, wheresoever this covenant is, and with whomsoever it is established, with them is the church, unto whom all the promises and privileges of the church do belong. Hence it was that at the coming of the Messiah, there was not one church taken away and another set up in the room thereof, but the church continued the same in those that were the children of Abraham according to the faith. The Christian church is not another church, but the very same that was before the coming of Christ, having the same faith with it and interested in the same covenant. And from this continuity of the church, Owen draws this final conclusion. It remains then that the church founded in the covenant, and unto which all the promises did and do belong, abode at the coming of Christ, and doth abide ever since, and among those who are the children of Abraham by faith. No individual person hath any interest in the promises, but by virtue of his membership with the church, which is and always was one and the same, with whomsoever it remains, the promises are theirs. And that not by application or analogy, but directly and properly. That final line there. The church unto whom all the promises belong are only those who are heirs of Abraham's faith, believing as he did, and thereby interested in the covenant. So what Owen is doing there is distinguishing two privileges granted to Abraham, corresponding ultimately to two kinds of seed. The first was a privilege according to the flesh. Abraham and his physical descendants were set apart as the line through which the promised Messiah would come, but that privilege was temporary. It reached its appointed end when Christ, the promised seed, actually appeared. And then alongside it, you have Abraham's him possessing another privilege that did not expire, namely his faith, becoming the pattern of the faith by which men in every generation would participate in the blessings of that covenant. Those who believe as Abraham believed are therefore his spiritual children. And this produces Owen's distinction between a seed according to the flesh and a seed according to the promise. Physical descent from Abraham, in other words, is not itself what gives someone an interest in the spiritual blessings of Abraham's covenant. Those blessings belong to Abraham's children by faith. Now, Owen himself is not drawing a Baptist conclusion from that distinction. But you can see immediately why a Baptist such as Hutchinson would seize upon it. Owen had supplied a vocabulary of temporary, fleshly privilege, spiritual privilege, and two kinds of Abrahamic seed that could be pressed against arguments for covenant membership grounded simply on natural descent. What did Hutchinson think of all this? Well, he thought that this made the Baptist case perfectly for him. He concluded that Hutchinson did, believers only are the children of Abraham, and none but such have an interest in the covenant made with him. And that, he would continue, if our opponents think Dr. O injured for our improvement of his words to our advantage, meaning that they should not be using Owen for a conclusion that he did not make himself, and some in fact did make that point, then he continued, we say that they are at liberty to reconcile Owen's words and his practice if they can. But to paraphrase, that would be a heavy lift. Arguments ensued over whether Owen even had in mind the case of infants at all here, or whether, as one defender of Owen wrote, that he had supposeth them visibly in covenant as the seed of parents visibly so. But it's important to see that Hutchinson was not claiming that Owen himself distinguished two Abrahamic covenants in the manner articulated by other Baptists like Cox. But rather, he believed Owen had supplied the covenantal categories by distinguishing the Mosaic covenant from the covenant of grace, and by recognizing within Abraham a twofold privilege and a twofold seed. The Baptists are then extending that hermeneutic to Genesis 17 itself, arguing that Abraham's fleshly and spiritual seed corresponded to those two distinct covenantal realities. The covenants represented perhaps the most significant place where Baptists found a fellow traveler in Owen. But Owen represented a source for all sorts of other theological points. For Keach, Owen was his most cherished and positively mentioned author, one whom he cited directly and indirectly several hundred times throughout his corpus. Many of those references dealt with Owen's interpretation of Hebrews 7 and 8, such as Keach's The Everlasting Covenant and other tracts which Owen was deployed in defense of other Baptists like Hercules Collins. But he was also a resource in Keach's work on biblical types and hermeneutical metaphors. Owen featured in Keach's ecclesiology, where he used Owen's catechism on church government to argue that membership in Christ's church rests upon regeneration rather than natural descent. That is, in his words, not members by generation, but by regeneration. In other places, Keach made extensive appropriation of Owen outside of the Baptist controversy, adopting both his analytical framework and many of his exegetical arguments to defend the abrogation of the Mosaic Sabbath and the divine institution of the Lord's Day. Owen is a source for Keach on the doctrine of justification too, repeatedly referring to Owen's insistence that sanctification evidences justification, but never constitutes its ground. It's that believers must renounce every plea founded upon personal obedience in favor of Christ's imputed righteousness alone. It's noteworthy, too, I think, that in books like these, with stated interest in proving that Baptists have the same faith with our brethren and all sound and orthodox Christians in the world, that Owen represents somewhat of a dogmatic authority on doctrine and a source to whom Baptists could turn for access to the whole canon of Reformed thought and even medieval theology as well. Owen, at some places, was an entry point into Anselm for these Baptists. That is true generally, but it's also true within the world of Congregationalism, where Owen's voice supported arguments about assembled church members' duties toward their pastors. Thomas Dillon was influenced by Owen's Order and Communion of Evangelical Churches in his defense of the separation of Protestant dissenters from the Church of England. William Kiffin could find useful Owen's discourse on the Holy Spirit. And I guess the overall picture that I'm trying to show you is that as you survey these early Baptist authors, it's that Owen was recognized as an authority on things like justification, on the atonement, the Trinity, pneumatology, the person of Christ, as well as federal theology and ecclesiology. Owen helped, in many cases, these Baptists show that they were not innovators, but well established within the Reformed tradition, even as some Baptists would argue amongst themselves about who was appropriating his work most precisely, as evidence, for example, by an early Baptist dispute involving Hercules Collins, Keach, Robert Steed, and Isaac Marlowe on congregational singing. Owen was a regular name in Baptist books, and many of the Owen books many of Owen's books were often sold alongside the books of prominent Baptists like Kiffin and Keach at Newgate Street, London. If Owen struggled to gain a readership throughout his life, a readership that some of his peers were able to boast, it at least appeared that he had earned Baptist appreciation. And late 17th century readers naturally began to group Owen and leading particular Baptists together as authorities on the same sorts of doctrinal questions. Nor was this association limited to Baptist authors themselves. Anonymous writers likewise placed Owen alongside Baptists as kindred theological voices, appealing to Knowles and Benjamin Keach before adding things like Dr. Owen and Dr. Goodwin and many other Reverend and Orthodox divines taught the same doctrine, suggesting, I think, that contemporaries were increasingly perceiving Owen and the particular Baptists as participants in a common theological tradition. Yet these connections appeared to extend beyond the printed page. For later in his career, Owen had come to occupy many of the intellectual and social networks as the particular Baptist. He attended London dissenting meetings in the 1680s alongside particular Baptists, including James Jones. He maintained friendly relations with the Baptist minister Henry Danvers. And although no documentary evidence demonstrates a personal acquaintance with Benjamin Keach, they had remarkably similar publishing and social networks, which makes such contact between them quite plausible. his literary and theological connections had also coincided with a gradual shift in his own posture toward the Baptists. As Crawford S. suggested, Owen's increasing interaction with Baptists, even going into the Restoration, may have helped moderate some aspects of his rhetoric concerning baptism, suggesting that influence that Owen had on them, it wasn't necessarily a one-way street. While Owen, of course, never abandoned paedobaptism, his developing relationships with Baptist ministers may have formed part of the historical context within which both his thought and Baptist appropriations of it could be understood. That point is important because it illustrates kind of the broader point I wanted to make earlier, that Owen's theology can't simply be abstracted from the historical circumstances in which it was formed and changed over time. And so you can note, again, as Crawford has helped us do in his treatment on this topic, in Owen's earliest ministry, Baptists occupied a world in which they were increasingly regarded as a dangerous group. And Owen's earliest references to them really do reflect some of those assumptions. His first published discussion of baptism in a display of Arminianism in 1643 attached to the sacrament a remarkably high efficacy, where he describes baptism as removing that which hinders our salvation, namely the sinner's inherent corruption. Only 2 years later, however, his catechism had already moderated that language, speaking instead of baptism as the ordinance through which, by his grace, believers are made children of God. And Owen's assessment of Baptists was developing too. In the mid-1640s, he was dismissing the Anabaptists as seditious sectaries. But the political and ecclesiastical upheavals of the 1650s soon placed him alongside Baptists in the Cromwellian settlement. The Racovian Catechism controversy brought Owen into cooperation with Baptist ministers such as Henry Jesse, relationships which plausibly represent something of a turning point in Owen's attitude toward the movement. You see, thereafter, Owen abandoned the baptismal regeneration-ish language of his youth, increasingly treating baptism in relation to sanctification and the visible church, rather than as an instrument affecting regeneration. This shift also helps explain Owen's increasingly restrained treatment of Baptist convictions. For although he continued throughout his life, again, to defend infant baptism, he repeatedly declined opportunities to attack Baptists themselves when he had the opportunity to do so. Rather than branding them as schismatics, he defended them against that charge. He distinguished their principles from those of heretical groups. And even in his longest discussion of baptism, declined to, quote, dispute who are the proper immediate objects of baptism, acknowledging the historical reservations of some early Christians concerning infant baptism. Yet Owen's growing familiarity with the Baptists did not result in his embracing a believer's baptism. I'll say that again. As we know, we have seen how he increasingly supplied theological resources that particular Baptists still found indispensable as they sought to tether themselves to the broader English Reformed theological culture. The fullest expression of this may be found in the Second London Confession. By adopting the Savoy Declaration as the structural framework of the 1689 confession. The particular Baptists situated themselves consciously within the English Reformed tradition, while simultaneously revising that inheritance at key points. And so the confession represents something of a reception that I've sort of sought to trace throughout this talk, not a wholesale dependence upon Owen, nor a wholesale rejection of him, but a careful appropriation within an emerging Baptist identity. Owen had spent much of the 1650s participating in successive attempts to define the doctrinal boundaries of English Protestantism, from the 16 brief fundamentals proposed in 1652 to a fuller 20-article confession prepared a few years later. In 1658, however, the congregational divines assembled for the Savoy Declaration. They set aside shorter documents and returned to the Westminster Confession and revised its theology a bit, and adding a substantially expanded account of congregational church order. Owen was not the Declaration's sole author, but he was a dominant voice in its deliberations. Its preface was widely attributed to him, and several of its characteristic additions reflected arguments that had recently been prominent in his theology. You can note language concerning the covenant of redemption and double imputation and the Trinity as the foundation of communion with God. Yet Savoy appeared well over a decade before the publication of Owen's exposition of Hebrews 7 and 8. And it should not, therefore, be treated as a confessional summary of the covenantal distinctions for which his later commentary became famous among Baptists. But when particular Baptists subsequently adopted Savoy as the principal model for their own confession, they therefore received an unmistakably Owenian and congregational theological inheritance, but one which they could preserve and extend and revise according to their own developing convictions. One of the bigger differences between Owen's Savoy and the Second London Confession seemed to be in chapter 6 and 7, where the Baptists did not retain Savoy's formulation that the covenant of grace was one and the same under differing administrations. Instead, they replaced it with language of the covenant's progressive revelation from Adam to its full disclosure in the New Testament. On the other hand, two further points make the dependence on Savoy especially clear, I think. First, the Second London Confession adopts almost verbatim Savoy's entire chapter of the gospel and of the extent of the grace thereof, a chapter with no equivalent in Westminster. It retains Savoy's account of the gospel as the revealed promise of Christ, the seed of the woman, together with its insistence that although the gospel is the outward means of revealing saving grace, conversion requires an effectual, inseparable work of the Holy Spirit upon the whole soul. Second, in its doctrine of the church, the Baptist Confession follows Savoy's expanded congregational rather than Westminster's presbyterial framework. The connection to Owen is especially evident there. In the years immediately surrounding the Savoy, he had published of Schism, a review of the true nature of schism, and an answer to a late treatise of Mr. Caudry about the nature of schism, works in which he defended the legitimacy and autonomy of gathered congregational churches against charges of schism. Particular churches consisted of saints visibly professing the faith who do willingly consent to walk together, and each gathered church receives from Christ the authority necessary for worship and discipline. Even consultation among churches remains advisory. Assembled messengers possess no jurisdiction over the churches themselves. The Baptists shortened and revised Savoy's treatment at several points, but they did preserve its basic vision for a voluntary, gathered, self-governing congregation under the immediate authority of Christ. So, how then do we speak of Owen's influence on the Baptists and the 1689 confession as a whole? To repeat, it helps first to recognize that his relationship with the Baptists did develop over time. It also helps to remember that, however Baptist sounding some of his words may appear, Owen never became a Baptist himself. Yet the changing context of his life, as I suspect we'll continue to hear about, repeatedly required him to articulate his convictions in new ways. Early in life, he could speak critically of Baptists. Later in life, much less so. Early in life, he described baptism in remarkably sacramental terms. Later, he spoke more cautiously of it as a sign and seal, a pledge, a testimony of grace, that sort of thing. There's another complication too, perhaps familiar to some of you. I didn't really touch on it here, but I thought I would mention just quickly the problem of Owen's posthumous publications. His commentary on Hebrews supplied Baptists with distinctions that they found enormously useful. But he had others like of infant baptism and dipping, where it appeared only decades later. It appeared after his death. And so does Owen's failure to publish that tract suggest that it no longer represented his mature thinking? Or was it simply material that he never had occasion to prepare for publication? And I think I fall in the place where I say I don't think we can know with confidence. We can take Owen at his word, but we do know that Owen died a Paedobaptist, and at least in his own mind, he could distinguish God's dealings with Abraham. He could emphasize the discontinuity introduced at Sinai, and still speak of the infant children of believers as admitted to the church and received in branches of a family upon which the blessing of Abraham had come. And yet, Baptists could still look to their darling Owen, as one writer described Keach's affection for him, and draw from a remarkably rich reserve of doctrine for their theology and for congregational life. They adopted him, they adapted him, and sometimes, as we've seen, they've carried his distinctions even beyond the conclusions that, at least as far as we can tell, he was willing to draw himself. And so I'll just conclude by saying, if Baptists have misread Owen, then just to paraphrase one of these early Baptist authors, it wasn't necessarily their problem. That was for others to reconcile his belief and practice. Thank you.